This morning your patent sold for a hefty sum. My manager phoned me out of the blue and ushered me into the corridor before saying something completely absurd. "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "I apologize. Do you mean the patent I received from my former employer?" The ridiculousness of it all perplexed me, but I chose to listen with a half-hearted attitude. It must have been a lie. "That's the one." "Indeed. However, why did you join this organization? Why did you come here from your prior employer?" At that moment, Lisa, a female employee, rushed up. "The CEO has called," she said. "He wants you to give him a call back right away." "Really? Did he mention the subject?" "He made no mention of details. The CEO simply insisted that it was urgent." I had an instinct when I heard this. Something must have come to light, and it had become a serious issue. With a mumble, I heard, "You've lost everything now," as someone slipped closer. "Hey, what's going on here?" I asked. "Boss, the CEO is waiting." My boss snapped his tongue in frustration. Then Lisa flashed a short smile before glaring at me and rushed away after saying, "Typical office worker." At 41, I enjoyed playing outside with friends from elementary school. Until the beginning of middle school, I started to consider high school. I found that I was suddenly really interested in science and math. Although it was difficult at first, I persisted, worked hard in my studies, and eventually was accepted to the high school of my choosing. Sciences for college, studying diligently and without interruptions to pass the entrance exams, research in the lab alongside like-minded colleagues. But I found that quiet, purely cerebral pursuits were insufficient. In order to maximize my time, I also worked part-time whenever possible, working in caves, the kitchen, and as a waitress at a beer pub. It was wonderful to be among energetic individuals. It brought back memories of my active early years. Even while I liked dealing with people, I also believed that since I had advanced this far in a science degree, I should apply the abilities I had acquired via study in my work. I therefore looked for work options appropriately and selected a sock manufacturing company from a number of offers. I worked in R&D and got a patent 7 years later. Although it wasn't enough to make me wealthy, it was a tiny achievement that made me feel accomplished, but it also brought with it a nagging feeling of ennui. I came to the realization that I would only grow more disinterested and deteriorate if I kept working at this job. I continued in the same position for 5 more years in spite of this realization. However, I made the decision to change occupations one day and accepted a position in sales, which is a totally different industry. It was confusing and full of obstacles at first, but now that I'm in my 7th year, even though it can still be difficult at times, I find it to be fascinating and think it was a wise career choice. I was promoted to assistant manager last year, which came with pride and additional responsibility. Tom, the head of the department, called me one day to inquire about something. Tom was a veteran who had worked for the corporation exclusively for 25 years. He was one of the sales managers when I started, but 4 years ago, he was elevated to the position of head of the sales division. However, it's unlikely that he gained it via actual skill. Did he subtly overthrow his competitors to gain that position? His patronizing demeanor and incredibly self-centered actions for a leader are evident. I thought he was talking about the contract when he inquired about the topic that was scheduled for next month, so I responded appropriately. "Yes, we are scheduled to finalize the contract in the middle of next month." "What? Not this month, but next month. That schedule has been the basis of our planning. Chris, you should have brought that up sooner. Are you being lazy?" I nearly shot back that I wasn't being lazy, but refrained. I kept blinking as I thought about what the boss had said. We had talked about this topic before. I had previously told him that next month would see the finalization of the deal. I remember saying that quite vividly. Is he acting to trick me, or is he simply forgetting? After about 15 minutes, our companions left the table, and it was just Catherine and me. I pondered on what to say next as I carefully admired her face. She looked even prettier than in her photos. "Alex, there's something I wanted to ask first." "Oh, what is it?" "Alex, have you ever been on an arranged date before?" Before I could answer, I was actually thinking of asking her the same thing. I told her it was my first time and asked if it was her first as well. She also said it was her first with someone as charming as me. "I'm surprised you'd need to go on an arranged date. Wouldn't you have plenty of suitors?" "Oh, you're too kind," she said, her tone gentle. But Catherine gave me a stern look. She probably thought I was being insincere, and I got a little worried. But that assertive side of hers was quite attractive to me. "Did I say something you didn't like? I wasn't trying to butter you up, honestly." I then shared with her about my long-term relationship ending due to a job in another state, how I came back to headquarters, got this arranged date offer from my department head, and how her photo made me want to meet her at first. I laughed at the idea of an arranged date, but it's just another way to meet people, even those group dates. When I was younger, I felt like group arranged dates were a bit odd. As I continued to share, Catherine's expression softened. "You broke up with your previous girlfriend 3 years ago, right?" she asked. I answered, "Yeah, in September. Sometime in September, I guess." Catherine smirked. "Actually, I broke up with my long-term boyfriend in September 3 years ago, too." I was at a loss for words at her unexpected confession. "Did you get over your ex?" she asked. "Yes, a long time ago," I replied, smiling. I couldn't help but smile too. And so our arranged date came to an end, and we agreed to meet again the following weekend. I was so eager to see Catherine again that I felt restless the entire week. Every night after work, I'd think about what to wear. I never used to care much about fashion, but I was quite indecisive. As I looked through my closet, I decided on a suit without a tie. Then the thought popped into my head, what about underwear? I quickly came back to my senses. I'm such an idiot, I thought. Worrying about that was way too premature for our first date. We met at 4:00 p.m. near an established department store close to the hotel where we had our arranged date. We planned to stroll around town for a bit and then find a decent restaurant for dinner. I could have booked a place in advance, but since I didn't know Catherine's preferences, I thought we'd decide on the go. Of course, I did some research and had shortlisted a few places. I arrived in town over an hour earlier than our scheduled time and checked the location of the restaurant I had in mind. After doing that, I went to the place where I was supposed to meet her. But even after our 4:00 p.m. meeting time, she was nowhere in sight. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I thought she might have stood me up. I was about to give up and head home when, while crossing the street, I thought of calling her to express my frustration. Then, from the other side of the intersection, I spotted her walking towards me with her cell phone in one hand. She noticed me too and waved enthusiastically. I rushed toward her, and we both stopped right in the middle of the crossing. "I was thinking of calling you and heading home because you were so late," I said. "I was there too. I was waiting for you right on time over there," she replied, pointing to our meeting spot. Suddenly, she burst out laughing. The pedestrian crosswalk signal started flashing with a beeping sound, and we both ran back to the sidewalk. "Alex, were you waiting over there?" she asked. I looked back at the beer hall named Penguin that she pointed to and silently nodded. "I was here. I was waiting here." "What?" she asked. She pointed ahead to the department store we had chosen as our rendezvous point. Right in front of its entrance stood the department store symbol, a penguin statue. In other words, we had agreed to meet by the penguin in front of the department store. However, I mistook it for a beer hall named Penguin across the street from the department store, while Catherine thought of it as the penguin symbol at the entrance of the store. "That's a funny mix-up," she said. "Glad we didn't miss each other." "Yeah, seriously," I replied. "Now that I think about it, I'm thirsty. How about we grab a drink at that beer hall to pay our respects to the penguin? Sounds good, she agreed. Since it was the weekend, the beer hall was already nearly 80% full, even though it was just before 5 p.m. We ordered a big pint of draft beer and some hot dogs to snack on. We had another good laugh about the penguin confusion and then started sharing more about ourselves. It turns out that the station nearest to Catherine's old place and where I used to live up until 3 years ago was the same. There were 3 lines at that station, but we both used the same one for our daily commute. I always bought a sports newspaper from the kiosk in the mornings, I said. You mean the kiosk on the far west side of the platform? I asked. Yes, that's the one, she replied. As I nodded, Catherine mentioned she frequented that kiosk too. She always bought an energy drink there. I remembered seeing a woman buying that drink several times. I guessed the brand of her energy drink, and Catherine looked at me in surprise. Did you ever bump hands with someone when paying? I asked, still in shock. Catherine nodded. I checked our commuting times, and our schedules overlapped. We might have met at that kiosk at the station. I felt a strange connection with Catherine, and we planned another date for the following weekend. For our second date, we managed to meet on time without getting the location wrong. We had a meal at a casual diner and then shared a drink at a relaxed bar. I was quite the drinker, but she could hold her own as well. The conversation shifted to hobbies. I mentioned that, while I hadn't been into it recently, I used to be really into watching plays a few years ago. I'm talking about small-time theater groups putting on shows at little venues. Not anything big, I said. I didn't particularly have a favorite troupe. I just randomly attended a theater, picked a play, and if it piqued my interest, I'd go watch that play next. It was the same old story. Depending on the play I went to see, sometimes it was fascinating, other times it was a letdown. The hits and misses varied greatly. I started mentioning the names of the troupes I remembered, saying, this one was a hit, that one was a miss, and another was a complete dud. You've probably never heard of these troupes, I said. Ever since I began talking about the theater companies, Catherine seemed to speak less. I wondered if I bored her with topics she wasn't interested in. I do know one of those troupes, she said suddenly. Really? That one? The total dud? I asked, surprised. I thought that company was as obscure as it gets. You know about such a company? I asked. After a brief pause, she made a sour face and said, that theater group? It's the one my ex, who I broke up with 3 years ago, was involved in. I was taken aback and cleared my throat. In situations like this, should I take back what I said about the company being a dud, or should I dig myself deeper? While I was at a loss for words, she spoke up first. I think I was there at the theater when you came to watch. I was helping out at the ticket counter. Well, I'm not so sure about that, I said, trying to recall. I remember arriving just in the nick of time that day, barely making it for the show. Our second date ended on an awkward note, yet we made plans to meet again the following weekend. Our third date began with a walk in a park in New York, known for its beautiful cherry blossoms in the spring. I used to come here often for company picnics, I said. I've been here a few times with friends, I added, deciding not to ask who those friends were. It might get awkward again if they were from the theater group. Although it wasn't cherry blossom season, the park was adorned with various flowers. Admiring flowers wasn't really my thing, so I quickly grew bored of the walk. Suddenly, carried by the wind, a savory aroma wafted towards us. It was coming from a food stand a little further ahead. That smells delicious, Catherine whispered. I had a similar experience, she said. Was it in this park? I asked. Yes, it was this park. It might have even been that restroom. I paused for a moment, remembering. A young man, who looked like a heavily intoxicated college student, tried to cut in line for the restroom. A middle-aged man in a suit, who was in line, confronted him and then a scuffle ensued. That's when another man, who seemed to be an acquaintance of the man in the suit, rushed over and managed to defuse the situation. Listening to her story, the memory of that time vividly came back to me. That man in the suit was my director, and the guy who stepped in later, that was me. Yours truly. You're kidding. You were there that day? She asked, surprised. Both of us were surprised and impressed by the unexpected connection from our past. A few days later, after work, my director invited me for a drink. We went to our usual large bar. As soon as we sat down, my director said, "How's it going with your arranged date? I heard you've met her a couple of times." I wasn't sure how to respond. I believed I had a good relationship with Catherine, but we had only been on 3 dates. I was indeed attracted to her, and I wanted to believe she had some affection for me as well, but it was uncertain how things would turn out in the future. I talked to her, and it turns out we've knowingly crossed paths before, I shared. Upon hearing this, my director had a pleased expression on his face, as if to suggest it's a perfect match. "Sounds like fate, doesn't it?" he said. Suddenly, a thought flashed through my mind. What if she's in this bar tonight, too? There had been a few times in the past when we unexpectedly ran into each other, but if we met in this bar tonight, it wouldn't just be a coincidence, it might be destiny. I excused myself, telling him I needed to use the restroom, and started searching the expansive bar. It was a tavern near the office, and it wasn't surprising to see familiar faces. However, there were mostly strangers. That's to be expected, I thought, especially in a bustling city like New York. What are the odds of running into that one woman? Conveniently, I decided to give up on the silly fantasy and return to where my boss was seated. Just as I was about to turn around, I heard a voice. "There you are," she said, standing right in front of me. "It's a coincidence, isn't it?" she remarked. I shook my head and replied, "Does it really feel like just a coincidence to you?" She stared back at me with a broad smile on her face.